Okay, let's open to Isaiah chapter 1. Actually, Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah structured his book rather well. It's got 10 main divisions. And the first 3 divisions covers chapters 1 through 5. And the first 5 chapters in the first 3 divisions, he lays down a number of different concepts and principles and so on that later begin to be elaborated upon in chapter 7 to chapter 66. But in chapter 6, which is the 4th division of his book, he gives us the call of him becoming a prophet. And therefore shows authoritatively why he can do what he says. So chapter 6, verse 1, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above him stood the Seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he did fly. And one cried unto another, saying, Holy, holy, holy is Jehovah of hosts, the whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. What's unique about Isaiah is he can also be titled the Gospel according to Isaiah the prophet, just like the Gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John, because, as we shall elaborate a bit more at the end of chapter 6, he has more first-coming prophecies than any other prophet, and other things which are unique to his specific writing. As to his Hebrew, he's a master of the Hebrew language. The whole book is put into Hebrew poetry. And Hebrew poetry is not based upon rhythm and rhyme, as English poetry is, but rather it's based upon what's called parallelism. You have line 1, and then line 2 goes back to line 1, then line 3, and line 4 goes back to line 3, and so on. Sometimes it's structured a little bit different. You have A, B, B, A, 4 lines. So you have a statement, first statement, second statement, third statement goes back to the second statement, and fourth statement goes back to the first statement. So it's mostly A, B, A, B, but now and then it's A, B, B, A. There are also other variants, but those are the 2 major ones. Only in the 4 of his chapters does he write this Hebrew prose, and that's chapters 36 to 39. 36 to 39. So this is unique. His contemporary, by the way, is Micah the prophet. And Micah is a country prophet, and his Hebrew is a lot more coarse than the Hebrew of Isaiah. And those of you that were here for the Jeremiah study, his response to his prophetic calling is very opposite of how Jeremiah responded. So verses 1 through 4, what he sees is the vision of the throne of God in heaven. In the first part of verse 1, what he sees is the temple of God, and he dates the vision in the year that King Uzziah died, which was 759 BC. 759 BC. Now, King Uzziah is detailed in 2 Chronicles chapter 26. 2 Chronicles chapter 26. Verses 1 through 5 describe his reign. He did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. He was a good king. Verses 6 to 15 describes his conquests and his might. But then he got a bit prideful. And in verses 16 to 23, he wanted to function and do some of the ceremonies that were limited to the tribe of Levi. And because he now felt he was king and a conquering king, and he brought wealth to the kingdom, therefore he can do things which he was prohibited to do by the Torah. And as a result, he was struck with leprosy. And therefore, because he was a leper, but also a king, they built him a separate little house where he would live, because he had to be separated from the rest of Jewish society. And any time somebody began to approach him, he had to warn the one approaching him, not with the words leper, leper, but the words unclean, unclean. Anyone touching a leper would become ceremonially unclean and therefore untouchable. 2 Kings chapter 15, verses 3 and 4, 2 Kings 15, verse 3 and 4 was a time of prosperity for the kingdom of Judah. But people in general did not truly respond spiritually. However, about the same time when King Uzziah died was also the time that the city of Rome was founded. And ultimately, Rome will be the one that's going to fulfill the prophecy within the call of Isaiah. It's also in verse 1, he says, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne. In other words, the king of Judah might die, as he has already just died, but this eternal king in heaven will never die. And God is forever sitting on his throne, watching over the destiny of the Jewish people. And the fact that he's sitting on the throne shows this king is ready to practice his kingly prerogatives of a judge. And one major function of a king is the role of a judge, and also to pronounce judgment. Initially, that would seem to contradict what we read in the book of Exodus chapter 19, verse 21, Exodus 19, 21, and chapter 33, verse 20, 33, verse 20, that says, no man can see the essence of God and live. And no man has seen God as he really is at any point of time. That point is emphasized in John chapter 1, verse 18, John 1:18, and 1 Timothy 6, verses 13 through 16, 1 Timothy 3, verses 13 through 16. So what Isaiah saw was not the actual essence of God. He would not survive it. But he simply sees the revelation of God in some visible form. And this would be what we call the Shekinah in Hebrew, the Shekinah, often connected with God's glory, the Shekinah glory of God. So you have the basic glory of God, most of it which is invisible. Whenever God's glory takes on some kind of a visible form, or when God's presence takes on a visible form, as Isaiah is seeing right here, it is not as God as he really is, but God appears as the Shekinah glory. And in fact, John chapter 12, verses 36 to 41, John 12, verses 36 to 41, John refers back to this Isaiah chapter 6 passage on the calling of Isaiah. And John points out what he really saw was the second person of the Godhead, the Messiah, in some visible form, which is being described here. And furthermore, the person sitting on the throne is high and lifted up, so Judah's king may sin. And even a righteous king like the one that just died might fall into acts of sin. But this king will never be guilty of any sin. And furthermore, his train filled the temple, not the temple here on earth, but the temple in heaven. And so magnificent that he saw in the appearance of God sitting upon the throne, that his robe alone filled the entire heavenly temple building. And the heavenly temple is also mentioned in other passages like 1 Kings 22:19, 1 Kings 22:19, Also in three passages in the book of Psalms, Psalm 11, verse 4, 11:4, Psalm 18, verse 6, 18:6, and Psalm 29, verse 9. Also in Jonah chapter 2, verse 7, Jonah 2, verse 7, Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 20, Habakkuk 2:20, and also Micah chapter 1, verse 2. Micah chapter 1, verse 2. And what he sees surrounding this very throne of God is a category of angelic or celestial beings that he calls the Seraphim. There's three categories of celestial beings, and going from bottom to the top, the lowest order are angels, with Michael being the chief angel, the one authority over the angels. Above the angels are the ones we read about here, the Seraphim, and above them are the cherubim. And they're distinguishable by their wings, for example. Angels are never described as having wings. Whenever they appear visibly, they always appear as young men, never as old men, never as baby angels shooting arrows at the time of Valentine's Day. They never appear in those forms. They're always as young men. And often they were mistaken for young men, which would not be the case if they had these two big wings hanging out their backs. So angels are never said to have wings. The seraphim that I mentioned here are 6 wings. We'll come back to them momentarily. And the highest order are the cherubim, of which there are 3 different categories. There are cherubs that have only 1 face and 2 wings. Others have 2 faces and 2 wings, and others have 4 faces and 4 wings. So we learned from Isaiah, not Isaiah, but rather we learned from Ezekiel chapter 28, 11 through 19, Ezekiel 28, 11 through 19, that Satan was created as a cherub. He was a member of the highest order. We're not told what kind of cherub he is, or what still is. We don't know if he had 1 face with 2 wings, 2 faces and 2 wings, and 4 faces and 4 wings. Now, if I was to guess, I don't like guessing, but now and then I engage in it. If I was to guess, I would say he was of the 2-faced variety. But I really couldn't prove that from the text. But he is a member of the highest order. But what we see here is the middle class, the seraphim, and while the angels are always viewed as before the throne and as far back as you can see, the seraphim are actually surrounding the throne, while the cherubim are actually, in the first 3 chapters of Ezekiel, actually bearing the throne and carrying the throne. And the Hebrew word seraph means a burning one, and it's used that way in Psalm 104, verse 4, Psalm 104, verse 4. But the seraphim are unique in they have 6 wings, and 2 wings are used for covering their feet, which emphasizes their humility. 2 to cover their face so that they don't be looking at the actual brightness of God's glory, and 2 are used to fly for the service of God. As to the ministry, it is similar to what we see in the 4 living creatures of Revelation chapter 4, verses 6 to 8. Revelation 4, 6 to 8. And so the living creatures of Revelation with 6 wings are the same as the seraphim of Isaiah chapter 6. And they focus on 2 of God's attributes, and the first attribute is his holiness. And 3 times they cry out, "Holy, holy, holy." And some assume they say holy 3 times to show the 3 members of the Godhead. But when you see a name used twice, then that's to call special attention, and if a name appears 3 times, is to call for very special attention. It does not necessarily prove any Trinitarian concept at this point. And in fact, we read in Jeremiah When he pronounces his curse on Jeconiah, he says, "O earth, earth, earth," 3 times over. "O earth, 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 hear the word of Jehovah." Just to call some extra special attention beyond the attention called when the name is used twice. And so the first attribute is to emphasize the holiness of God, that he's free from any and all imperfections. And this revelation of God emphasizing his holiness is the source of Isaiah's favorite term for God, the Holy One of Israel. It's used exactly 24 times within the book of Isaiah. Outside of the book of Isaiah, it is rarely found. Once in 2 Kings 19, 3 times in the book of Psalms, Psalms 71, 78, and 89, 71, 78, and 89, twice in Jeremiah, chapter 50 and 51, 50 and 51, but that's it, was Isaiah uses it 24 times. And critics who don't believe that God himself could ever give such exact prophecies as he does, because in the first 39 chapters, the prophecies focus mostly on Assyria, who in Isaiah's day brought down the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. But what they call second Isaiah, comprising chapters 40 through 66, had to be written by somebody other than Isaiah, because now the focus is not on the Assyrian Empire, but on the Babylonian Empire. And what the evidence says, there's no such thing as a second Isaiah, that the Holy One of Israel, that he's named 12 times in the first 39 chapters and 12 more times in the rest of Isaiah. And the vocabulary of so-called second Isaiah is the same as the vocabulary of first Isaiah, still using the Hebrew poetic concepts. And furthermore, it's also referred to once as the Holy One of Jacob in chapter 29, verse 23, 29, 23, and several times as simply the Holy One in several segments of Isaiah, both in first half and second half. There's definitely a shift in the content, moving from Assyria to Babylonia, but that doesn't prove there's some kind of a second Isaiah living about a century later. The first attribute they focus on is the holiness of God, but then the second attribute is the glory of God. And the glory is the source of all his other attributes. And in verse 4, the results of the declaration of holiness. Holy, 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 and suddenly the foundations of the threshold in heaven began to shake. The temple is filled with smoke, and smoke is one of the Shekinah glory visible signs of the very presence of God. And that's where suddenly Isaiah is much more conscious of his sin. So in verses 5 to 7, we have the cleansing of the prophet. And in verse 5, then said I, woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, Jehovah of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphim unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongues from off the altar, and he touched my mouth with it, and said, Lo, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is forgiven. So we have the account of the cleansing of the prophet. And what Isaiah is most conscious, not just conscious of his sinfulness, but also specific area of his sinfulness. And in verse 5, he says, and I said, woe is me, I am undone. Literally, the Hebrew says, I'm about to be put out of existence. I'm about to put utterly out of existence. And that for three reasons. Number one, for I'm a man of unclean lips. So while the lips of the seraphim were saying, "Holy, holy, holy," those of Isaiah were focusing on his lips as a means of sinfulness. And he had to cry the same cry that a leper would have to cry, "Unclean lips." And only when one can see God's holiness can he fully recognize his own sinfulness. And this was true with Job in chapter 1, verse 8, in chapter 2, verse 3, 1:8 to 3, as well as chapter 42, verses 5 and 6. Job 42, verses 5 and 6. The second reason he gives, "I dwell with a people of unclean lips." And those how conscious he is specifically of the sinfulness of his lips. And the third reason, "I saw Jehovah the King." And because he's seeing the visible presence of God, he's afraid he's about to be undone, especially because of his sinfulness in contrast to God's holiness. And often when people first see the visible God, they're afraid they will soon die, as is the case in Genesis chapter 32, verse 30, 30, also in Judges chapter 6, verse 22 and 23, Judges 6, 22 and 23, and chapter 13, verse 22. Judges 13, verse 22. But he's not seeing God as he really is. He's seeing the Shekinah glory, a visible manifestation of God. And so because he's most conscious of the sin of his lips, his sin is now cleansed with a coal from the altar. The altar is the place of sacrifice that's connected with blood as the means, though no blood was shed in heaven, but the blood in the temple on earth. But what he sees is the heavenly temple. And so one of the seraphim comes with a hot coal and touches the lips of Isaiah, where he is most conscious of his sin. And the result was, number one, the iniquity was taken away. Secondly, sin was covered or atoned. That's as far as the Hebrew Bible can go. It can cover the sin, but it could not take it away. When Messiah dies, only then will the sins of the Old Testament saints be removed. And the result is, in this case, the guilt of the iniquity was taken away, and sin was covered or atoned. And then he receives his call. And look at verse 8 through 10. "And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me. And he said, Go and tell this people, Hear you indeed, but understand not. See indeed, but perceive not. Make the heart of this people fat. Make their eyes heavy. Shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn again and be healed." So now the prophet receives a commission. And just as God told Jeremiah, don't anticipate any large-scale revivals or repentance. And that created a lifetime of sadness for Jeremiah. But Isaiah is not of the same human quality as Jeremiah was. So in verse 8 is the call. Notice the call that goes from singular to plural. And the call can only come after the sin has been cleansed. And notice unity followed by plurality. Unity, whom shall I send? Plurality, who shall go for us? And that focuses on the triune nature of the Godhead. God is one, therefore who shall I send? God is three, who will go for us? In the second part of verse 8, Isaiah responds with that word hineni that we talked about with the call of Moses. Hineni, here am I. Abraham said this, as we pointed out, so did Jacob, so did Moses ultimately. It's a response of submission and service to God. So who will go for us? And Moses and Isaiah responds, "Here am I, send me." So he immediately, Jeremiah not so immediate. Ezekiel took a whole week of meditation before he finally agreed to be a prophet. But Isaiah was immediate. There's a different nature if we did Jeremiah or Ezekiel. And so he's already told, after already accepting the office of a prophet, okay, Isaiah, the worst is yet to come. And in verse 9, he'll be dealing with a people, and therefore he receives a declaration of their inability to understand. In verse 10, there's a declaration of hardening. And notice those three phrases. Number one, fatten the heart of the people, so they have no feeling for the work of divine grace. Secondly, make their ears heavy, literally to make them dull of hearing. They'll have an inability to listen to spiritual truth. And thirdly, shut their eyes. Literally in Hebrew, to smear thickly, they will have an inability to see. It result in three problems: spiritual blindness, spiritual deafness, and spiritual non-understanding. Reason, lest they should repent and be healed. So because of continuous hardening of their own hearts, now they will be hardened for good, so punishment will come down. And so the nature of God is absolute holiness, and therefore at some point God has to move to punish, whether in the immediate future or the distant future, it so must come. And then the place will be totally desolated with no inhabitants. The inhabitants will be removed from the land. That's already moving towards the captivity and even beyond to the worldwide dispersion. And ultimately, the prophecy as it sets down in the short term and long term will be fulfilled in two stages. First of all, in AD 70, at the end of the first Jewish revolt, where you have masses of Jews taken into a status of dispersion, and even worse, in the second Jewish revolt, which ended in the year 135 AD. And by then, the Jewish population in the land became a minority in their own land. But in verse 13, you have the return. And if there be yet a tent in it, it also shall be in turn beaten up, as a terebinth, as an oak, whose stock remains when they are felled, so that the holy seed is the stock thereof. It describes a second wave of judgment in verse 13, beyond that which happened with Babylon, Assyria. And we'll find after a second wave of judgment, beyond the time of Rome, a remnant of Jews will return, and we've seen that with the present return of the Jews from the dispersion, but they too will be eaten up. They'll be eaten up by the Great Tribulation. Because Isaiah will point out that there's going to be two different regatherings. First of all, a regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment, followed by a second regathering in faith, followed by blessing. And the judgment following the first regathering in unbelief will be the tribulation, and the blessing of the second worldwide regathering in faith and preparation specifically for the blessings of the Messianic kingdom. And so he points out, it will sprout to life again, and the holy seed will regrow into a tree, which will be the Messianic kingdom. So as we read this book of Isaiah, you will notice the poetic structure, except for 4 chapters. And he will give us prophecies about the first coming that no other prophet would give us. And it begins right in the very next chapter, chapter 7, verse 14. Behold, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. And Isaiah will have different names for the Messiah. This is just one of them, Emmanuel. And sometimes people ask, well, why wasn't Yeshua, Jesus, called Emmanuel? Well, it's not his primary name, but Isaiah gives us more than one name, and other prophecies give other ones. For example, look at chapter 9. Verse 6, 9:6. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father. The Hebrew better reads Father of Eternity, and Prince of Peace. Now, 3 of these 4 names clearly show deities. So it says, a son is given to whom the government shall be upon his shoulder. That emphasizes Messiah's humanity. Now, in English, we use the word wonderful for both God and man, but in classical Hebrew, the word wonderful, in Hebrew, Pele, P-E-L-E, P-E-L-E, Eli is only used of God, either what he is or what he does. Either what he is, wonderful, or what he does, wonderful things. Second name, Mighty God. Third name, the Father of Eternity, the one who gives eternal life. So you have 3 names which clearly imply deity. The only exception to the rule is the 4th name, Prince of Peace or Shalom, which by itself does not carry the concept of deity, but within the book of Isaiah, these terms are used specifically of God within the book of Isaiah itself. So you have not just Emmanuel, you have these other names. And he's called by all these names, though his personal name will be Yeshua, from the Hebrew word Yasha, meaning to save. Another example of a first coming prophecy, chapter 11, verse 1, there shall come forth a shoot out of the stock of Jesse, and a branch out of his roots shall bear fruit. And after the end of chapter 10, he shows the mighty army of Assyria being cut down like a forest of trees cut down. Nevertheless, there is one stuck. It has already been felled, and looks like just a dead stump, never to bear fruit again, but it will. And notice he doesn't say the stock of David, he says the stock of Jesse. When you think of David, what you think is of a mighty conqueror, a king. When you think of Jesse, you think of a poor shepherd family in Bethlehem. And Messiah will arrive only when the house of David has been reduced to what it was in Jesse's day, a poverty-stricken family. And so when Miriam offered the offering for a firstborn son, the offering was 2 birds. And that was only allowed if you could not afford anything better. And the fact that she offered 2 birds shows they were poverty-stricken. Now, Psalm 22 is the first psalm. Go to chapter 53 for a moment. But Psalm 22 is the first passage that tells us Messiah will die. Before that, many messianic prophecies, but nothing about Messiah dying. But it doesn't say why he dies, just that he dies a violent death. But look in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 10, Isaiah 53:10. Yet it pleased Jehovah to bruise him, he had put him to grief. And when he shall make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of Jehovah shall prosper in his hand. And here we're told why the Messiah dies. In English, in most English renderings, it says an offering for sin, but that's not the Hebrew word. There's a Hebrew word for sin, but that's not the word that's used here. It's the word asham, A-S-H-A-M, A-S-H-A-M. And the asham is the trespass offering. The sin offering was for an inadvertent sin, but the asham offering is for both inadvertent sin, but also for premeditated sin. He died for all kinds of sin, for every type of sin. Only in Isaiah 53, only at this point for the first time does it reveal Messiah would die a substitutionary death. There's also some unique second coming prophecies. And most people only look at Zechariah 14 without checking everything Zechariah says and assume that the initial return will be at the Mount of Olives. But look at Isaiah. I'll give you two passages. You can mark down one, Isaiah 34, verses 1 through 7. Isaiah 34, verses 1 through 7. But now turn to Isaiah 63. Isaiah 63. Isaiah in this passage is standing along the mountain ranges of Israel looking towards the southeast, and he sees a graphic and glorified figure approaching him. And the question and answer session ensues between Isaiah and this individual. Two questions are raised and two questions are answered. Question number one is in verse 1. Who is this that comes from Edom, with dyed garments from Bozrah? This who is glorious in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. The answer, end of verse 1, I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Only one person can fit this description, and only one person can make the claim that this one makes, and this is a description of the return of the Messiah. Returning to Israel, but notice where it's returning to Israel from. The land is Edom, today that's southern Jordan. And the city is Bozrah, today that is Petra. Next thing Isaiah notices that as the figure approaches closer, he notices that his clothing, though they are enveloped by the Shekinah glory, is also marked with redness, blood redness. And that raises a second question in verse 2. Wherefore are you red in your apparel, and thy garments like him that tread in the wine vat? And the answer comes in verses 3 through 6, that he entered into a massive battle against all the armies of the Antichrist, had to trample the enemy, and the trampling of the enemy, the lifeblood spilled over and stained his garments. But notice where the fighting took place. The land is Edom or southern Jordan. And the city is Petra, ancient Bozrah. Now don't lose your place in Isaiah. Just turn to Zechariah for a moment. Look at chapter 14. Zechariah 14. Verse 4 says, his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives. But what precedes him standing upon the Mount of Olives? So in verses 1 and 2, all the armies of all the nations come against Jerusalem, and they take Jerusalem. And then in verse 3, then shall Jehovah go forth and fight against those nations when he fought in the day of battle. And so notice what it spells out, that the fighting against the armies precedes the timing when he stands upon the Mount of Olives, because they'll fight against those nations in the territory between Bozrah and the walls of Jerusalem. Let's not ignore the couple of statements. Go back to chapter 12 and look at verse 7. And notice the order of their physical redemption. Trying to find the exact verse. Give me a minute. Zechariah, chapter 12. Yeah. Okay, verse 7 is correct. Jehovah shall save the tents of Judah first. before the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem be not magnified above Judah. Notice Judah is now living in homes, they're living in tents, because they've had to flee the land since the midpoint of the tribulation. And the majority of the flight to the city of Petra or Botzra, that's Micah chapter 2, verse 12, Micah chapter 2, verse 12. There'll also be Jews fleeing to Assyria, which is now northern Iraq and Egypt, but the majority of the leadership and the people will be in the city of Petra Botzra. Notice he will fight, he will save the tents of Judah before he rescues those of Jerusalem. As he rescues those of Jerusalem in chapter 14, but before he gets to Jerusalem, he'll save the tents of Judah first. And so the ascent to the Mount of Olives will be at the end of the battle, not at the initial first stage of a second coming. These are some of the important elements of Isaiah's prophecies. Another thing to notice, there says a lot about the final restoration of Israel. We're going to look at one example. Let's go back to Isaiah 11. The entire passage or context begins in chapter 11 and verse 11 down to chapter 12, verse 6. He's describing that final worldwide regathering in faith in preparation for blessing. But notice how he numbers it. Verse 11, shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people that shall remain from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. He will set up an ensign for nations, will assemble the outcasts of Israel, and get together dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So notice in the final regathering, when all the Jews are brought back for the Messianic kingdom, he numbers it as the second one. If the last one is the second one, how many more can you have before the second one? Only one more preceding it. And so the first worldwide regathering is what we have seen now, the worldwide regathering in unbelief and preparation for judgment, but then will come the second worldwide regathering of faith in preparation for the blessings of the kingdom. There are many other examples, but my time is running out, so we'll draw this to a close. Another major area is the details of the Messianic kingdom. Some examples include chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, chapter 11, verses 6 to 9, 11, 6 to 9, and chapter 65, verse 17 to 25, chapter 65, verses 17 to 25. Okay, let me close with Rabbi's story. We should have a few minutes for questions. It's a story of a rabbi who had an Orthodox Jewish synagogue in the area of New York City. He was paid enough to meet his monthly expenses, but never had any money left over. He had this great desire to visit the land of Israel, but never had the money to go. And so a day came when somebody gave a donation to the synagogue, marked for a rabbi's trip for 1 month to Israel. There was enough money for him to bring his wife, so he has to come with him. His wife says, listen, if I go to Israel with you, we'll have to bring my mother. And Rabbi says, that's not a good idea. Let's face it, your mother and I never get along. Every time she comes over, we have at least one argument, sometimes even two arguments. And so we're going to be in Israel for 30 days. That's going to mean anywhere from 30 to 60 arguments. This is not a good idea. But his wife said, listen, if I go to Israel and I'll bring her, I'll never hear the end of it. She will crutch, she will complain, she'll drive me to an early grave. So to keep peace in the family, either just go by yourself, it'll be fine with me. But if you want me to come with you, I'll have to bring her with me just to keep the peace. Rabbi says, well, I don't want to go to Israel by myself, so go ahead and bring her. I'll find a way to live with it. left for Israel, and as he was afraid, every day there was one argument, sometimes two. And then about halfway to the tour, suddenly they're in Jerusalem, and suddenly his mother-in-law passes away and dies. She goes to the American consulate to see what he can do about getting the body back to New York. The family has some family plots in the Jewish cemetery. And so he had to find out how to do it. But the consulate worker says, Rabbi, it will be rather expensive. It'll cost you about $30,000. But since she's a Jewish woman, she could be buried right here in Jerusalem. And it'll only cost you about $3,000. Rabbi thought for a moment or two and said, no. No matter what the cost, I want her body sent back to New York. I'll find a way to pay the money off later. And the consulate worker said, you must really love your mother-in-law to put out this expense. She'll be in debt for a long time. But the rabbi says, well, that's not really where I'm coming from. It's just I remember a story. I don't know if somebody told me the story. Maybe I read it somewhere. I don't know how I know the story, but I heard of a story of a man who was buried here in Jerusalem, but then 3 days later he came back to life. I can't take that chance.